Yes, so I'm sure as you can all see, these slides show some of the facts of why it's important with a specific focus on this issue. Ensuring sexual and reproductive health and rights is not just a luxury or something that we could think about. It's really a life-saving priority and should be so also in humanitarian response. So the aim of this conference really is to shed light upon the magnitude of the problems, but certainly also look at some of the possible solutions. And I truly hope that when we leave today, we will all have learned something new. We will have challenged our current thinking about this, and we will have been inspired to do something more about this humanitarian tragedy. And we do have an exciting program ahead of us, and we should really get started. And who better to kick us off than the dynamic chair of our all-party parliamentary group for sexual and reproductive health, METTE GJERSKOV. She's the chair, she's also a former minister, and she's the spokesperson of the Social Democrats for Development Corporation. METTE, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tania, for that wonderful introduction. I'll have to have it on tape, I think. Your Royal Highness Crown Prince Mary, ministers, ambassadors, colleagues and friends, on behalf of all the organizers, and of course particularly on behalf of the entire all-party parliamentary group on sexual and reproductive health and rights, they are my colleagues from all parties represented here in Parliament. I bid you welcome. To our international guests, also welcome if it's the first time you visit the Folketing, the Castle of Christiansborg. Welcome here to you, and apologize on behalf of the weather. It's cold. I hope to see you again when we have Women Deliver in Denmark, because that's in May, and it's much warmer at that time. I welcome you because I'm so happy that all of you are here at this important conference on a very, very urgent topic. How does the situation for women, for girls, for men, and for boys trapped in humanitarian conflicts or crisis, what does this situation look like when it comes to the protection of sexual and reproductive health and rights? Human suffering from the impact of conflicts and disasters has reached staggering levels. Today, almost 60 million people have been forced from their homes by natural disasters, by conflicts or violence. In the past 2 decades, more than 200 million people were affected by disasters. And in the midst of this human tragedy, sexual and reproductive health and rights may, to some, sound as an abstract concept, or at least as a topic which might not be about life and death in the same way as when we provide food, clean water, basic shelter. But as we shall see today, sexual and reproductive health and rights is not a minor issue in humanitarian settings. And it is certainly also a matter of life and death. I would like to share a personal story with you. A story about the fact that help comes in all kinds of shapes and forms, sometimes even in disguise. As you can see, I'm not a photographer, I'm sorry. Don't look at the quality of the photo. This is my photo, that's why I brought it, because it's mine. I took it myself with my iPhone in Satari refugee camp in Jordan. And these Syrian children are to me the symbol of how vulnerable boys and girls are in a humanitarian crisis. I hope that these children are safe and sound, as I hope it for all the other children. But sometimes when I look at my photos from the camp, I really hope that they haven't been exposed to the dangers of the Mediterranean now, or to sexual and violent cruelty from human traffickers. In Jordan, I also met not just the children, but also a man. I'm not a photographer, I'm not a model either, as you can see, so please look at the man at the left. He is a businessman. He has good reputation in the local community. And he chose to work together with the Jordanian IPPF, and here he is. Having Sharia studies at his university resume, he stood up for refugee women in the local society. He talked about family planning. He talked against violence in the family. He talked against child marriages. He took action. And he serves as a role model. So we need not just women, but also men as our allies in this very, very important situation. And maybe I should add as a last thing, this is about what is happening in the local community. Because not all the problems are in the refugee camps. We need to remember that so many people live outside the camps and they need our help as well. So, what is it that we see in humanitarian crisis? Maternal mortality increases dramatically during disasters and conflicts. Human rights violations related to sexuality and gender are massive. Women, girls, children are subject to sexual assaults with serious consequences in terms of ill health, unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections. We know that when society collapses, when the family structure collapses, they are the vulnerable ones. So in countries of crisis and in long-term refugee camps, we see a substantial rise in the number of forced and early marriages. We see lack of family planning measures that allow families to build resilience, and the list can continue. In some of these countries, among some of these people, sexual and reproductive health and rights is furthermore a topic which is extremely sensitive. This further complicates which measures that can be put into place to help victims and vulnerable people. So we need to deliver critical life-saving services in humanitarian settings around the world. That's what we are here to discuss today. We need training humanitarian workers to deal with pregnancy and childbirth and reproductive health and in the aftermath of rape and violence. And a good thing is that often women are well positioned to find solutions themselves. We saw that in Haiti after the big earthquake in 2010, where the incidence of rape increased markedly. Women mobilized within the displacement camps, and it helped reduce incidence of rape by 80% in one of the camps. Sometimes it's simple measures. Installation of light powered by solar batteries contributed to a reduction in the gender-based violence in the camps. So when we're talking about these issues, this is not solved issues. This is matters of life and death. And too often they are neglected. So, when I see you guys in the room today, men, women, and I look at the list of speakers for this conference, I feel that we might have a chance of doing this better in the future. We owe it to the girls and women and the boys and men out there who need the same protection as and to protect their rights as you have, all of you in the room, and me. So let's get this conference started and let's go out there and change it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mette. I'm sure that everybody here could feel that this is certainly a topic very close to your heart. So now, in a minute, I'm very happy to pass the floor to Her Royal Highness, Crown Princess Mary, for an opening remark. I'm not sure whether everybody knows this, but Her Royal Highness has been working actually for several years now on promoting the rights of girls and women, including their sexual and reproductive rights. And I'm proud to say that she is really a true champion that does not only speak about these matters at big fancy global conferences or UN meetings, she actually also goes to the ground. She goes to talk to women and girls in vulnerable situations, and then she does what's even better. She brings those stories and voices to the tables where decision makers sit, and they listen. So I'm really proud to have you here today, and I'm proud to give you the floor. Please.
Thank you for such a warm introduction. I might tape it as well. Good afternoon. The Executive Director of UNFPA, Dr. Babatunde Osotimehin, was recently quoted as saying, "The health and rights of women and adolescents should not be treated as an afterthought in humanitarian response." This statement is, of course, true, but for me, it says so much more than just that single statement. It says that right now, in many circumstances, we are failing to protect the fundamental human rights of women and girls. That crimes against women and girls are often silent and don't receive the focused and prioritization that they warrant. That women and girls of childbearing age between 15 and 49 made up 25% of more than the 100 million people in need of humanitarian aid in 2015. And it says, women and girls in need of aid because of conflict or disaster and without the protection of family and community are more vulnerable to sexual violence, sexually transmitted diseases, and unwanted pregnancies. We must recognize that for a woman who is about to give birth, or the adolescent girl who survived sexual violence, life-saving services are as vital as water, food, and shelter. And it says our current protection and responses strategies must include the needs of this target and vulnerable group. So I would sincerely like to thank the organisers, International Planned Parenthood Foundation, the Danish Family Planning Association, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights for organising this extremely important conference. This conference confirms that in the global community there is a promising and strengthened focus on this complex issue. War, instability, epidemics and disasters have left a long trail of chaos and destruction, resulting in the need for humanitarian aid being significantly outweighed by the growth in funding and services. We need to ensure that the humanitarian action includes recognition of the needs and vulnerabilities of this majority group, and that protection is always the core of humanitarian action. In many parts of the world, even under normal conditions, reproductive health issues are a leading cause of death and illness among women of childbearing age. The majority of these deaths and disabilities are preventable and unnecessary and result from the lack of access to services and information. We're talking about 800 women who die from complications during pregnancy or childbirth every single day. Of these 800 tragedies, 507 of them occur in emergency situations. Crises and humanitarian settings account for 60% of all preventable maternal deaths around the world. In fact, in 2014, the World Health Organization documented that the 10 countries with the highest maternal mortality ratios in the world are affected or emerging from war. The death of a mother very often means that newborn babies or small children are left behind, and who, with their prime caregiver taken away, are more likely to die themselves. And the statistics tell the same story. Crises account for 53% of deaths of children under the age of 5 and 45% of neonatal deaths. Many complex circumstances and urgent needs arise when crises strike. Healthcare services, skilled birth attendants, and emergency obstetric care often become unavailable. And women face other threats as well. The absence of health services and other factors increase the risk of contracting HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. And the breakdown of protection system often leads to the rise in gender-based violence, as we have already heard. This includes rape and sexual assault, human trafficking, domestic violence, and early enforced marriage. As a result of the prolonged Syrian crisis, the Danish Refugee Council have witnessed the depletion of refugees' resources, the level of poverty, and that debt is resulting in negative coping mechanisms. And one of these is the critical and dangerous trend is the resort to child labour. Not only are children working in dangerous and exploitative conditions, they are also much less likely to attend school. Another negative coping mechanism is early enforced marriage. DRC has witnessed that the difficult financial situation of Syrian families is encouraging early enforced marriage, as we know, as girls become the financial burden of their husbands upon marriage. And gender-based violence is also very prominent. Syrian refugee women are in critical situation, as many have lost their husbands and other family relatives in war, or the husband is still in Syria or elsewhere. And this leaves the women and female-headed refugee households fearing for their safety, more exposed to gender-based violence, and restricted in their movements, which again impacts their ability to access health facilities and employment opportunities. Wherever humanitarian disaster occurs, the burden of care women assume for children and others make it difficult for them to take proper care of themselves. Women may or often do neglect their own needs as they care for their families and neighbours. Over the last many years, as patron of UNFPA and the Danish Refugee Council, I've had the opportunity to visit a number of camps for refugees and internally displaced people. Different countries, different camps, and different reasons for their existence. From Dadaab in Kenya to Zatari in Jordan, to Zai Tama in Myanmar, to Tekiti in Ethiopia. And these visits have left a strong impression on me. And while it's truly distressing to witness the often extremely difficult circumstances under which they live, they exist. At the same time, I cannot be anything but enormously impressed by the courage, skills, and ingenuity of the women and girls I have met. And I would like to name just two interventions that for these women and girls had a significant impact on their lives in these camps. In Zatari camp, I spoke with a number of heavily pregnant women. And they were already mothers and therefore knew the risks associated with childbirth. In Syria, they had given birth in hospitals with their own gynecologist and midwives. For them, the presence of UNFPA's Reproductive Health Unit turn their fear and the potential risk associated with giving birth into thankfulness and hope. Today, UNFPA is delivering a larger share of its reproductive health services in crisis settings. In Tikiti in Ethiopia, I witnessed the distribution of UNFPA's dignity kits. Now, these kits contain menstrual pads, soap, underwear, as well as other supplies required by circumstances or cultural contexts. The importance of these kits are not just for their own dignity, as they themselves describe them. They also provide relief. Relief that, for example, during their menstruation, they could continue to move about and provide water and food for their children. And here we must remember the cultural sensitivities and how they affect women. Experience shows that in crisis, women and girls are not only victims. They can also be leaders. They can also constitute an important resource to combat the challenges they face. Traditional gender roles often change during situations where it becomes necessary for women and girls to take on unconventional responsibilities and activities. And I've personally witnessed how women are capable of finding innovative ways to cope, how they assume a role to protect and support their families, and how they often continue to play pivotal roles in contributing to their local surroundings. We must continue and increase support of this valuable resource. So even though women and girls are extremely vulnerable, that we're all in agreement on, in humanitarian crisis, and they have particular protection needs, but they are also a resource to be utilised. Whether women live or die in a crisis often depends on whether they can access basic sexual and reproductive health services, which too often take a back seat to other urgent needs, like food and shelter. We need to build a better and more durable shelter. And this includes humanitarian responses that go far beyond the provision of food and shelter, as essential as those things are, and include reproductive health and family planning services and protection against gender-based violence. In 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit will convene, where stakeholders within humanitarian assistance will discuss how to improve the response to the needs of millions of people affected by conflict and disaster. This provides an opportunity to highlight sexual and reproductive health services as an important element of all humanitarian response. Women and girls' vulnerability to crisis is not a sign of weakness, but of inequality. Women and girls are powerful. If their needs are met and rights protected, they can become the catalyst of change. From the rubble of a crisis to the development, resilience, and stability of their families, communities, and nations. Women and girls, as an afterthought, won't do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's truly a great inspiration to have a crown princess in our country that does not only speak about nice and uncontroversial issues, but really dares to speak out about these issues that are so difficult in so many contexts. So thanks a lot for that. So now, after these two power women, I think it's time for a little gender shift. So let me invite to the stage TEWODROS MELESSE, who is the General Director of IPPF, who's one of the organizers, and also our Minister for Foreign Affairs, KRISTIAN JENSEN. Please join me up here for a short conversation. All right. Now, I'm really happy that these two men are not just any men. Both of them have the position and the power to do something about today's topic. So, happy about that. Let me direct my first question to you, TEWODROS. Now, you're the general director of the biggest family planning NGO of the world. You work in 172 countries and have 147 national member associations. Couldn't you start by telling us a little bit about how you view the actual situation of sexual and reproductive health in current crisis and what you see as the main challenges?
Thank you. First of all, thank you. First of all, I would really try to begin by expressing our deep appreciation and gratitude to Her Royal Highness Crown Prince Mary and His Excellency Mr. JENSEN for lending their support and providing the leadership which is required in this critical area. I'm also very much honored and pleased to be here with Sex and Sanfeld, which is our member association. And today it is its 60th anniversary, so I say happy birthday to you. I think, the most critical thing about sexual reproductive health in general, and in particular in humanitarian setting, is the hypocrisy of humanity, which is in denial of sexuality. Sex gives life, gives pleasure, but we are in denial. So when it is in a humanitarian setting, it becomes an excuse. What they need is a tent, what they need is food, and we try to ignore that sex takes place and women and girls are there. I mean, just to give you an example, let's assume, take it personally, and you are pregnant, expecting to give life in a few weeks' time. And then you need medical assistance, you need the care and support of your family, but there is a conflict which is erupting. What do you do? Where do you go? Where do you flee? You are left by yourself to be dealing with your health as a shoulder for your humanity. It's really very difficult for people who are displaced. Most of them who are staying behind are women, girls, and young people. The men, either they run away to fight or for any situation. And that danger, which is resulting also to rape, sexual violence, the trauma of the conflict itself, which is a very simple thing of getting sanitary pad. All this, what a woman is going through. So for us, what is our most important thing? We are not a humanitarian organization, but we are locally owned and we exist in different parts of the community. We don't run away when there is a conflict, because the population is there. Like you're here from our association in Syria. When the war broke, our people, both the volunteers and the staff, they didn't run away. They were part of the community and they have to respond to the needs of women and girls and the community in the area of sexual and reproductive health. I'll give you one story of Amal in a conflict situation in Syria. She had been severely beaten by her husband, had bruises on her face, and was in fragile condition when she was admitted to the Family Planning Association hospital. Thanks to the integrated package, it's not just healing the wound, but also giving the advice, the psychological advice. She says, I feel more aware of my rights today because I got the services from the Family Planning Association. In general, women and girls are disproportionately affected. It doesn't mean men are not affected, young boys are not affected, but it is the women who are remaining, who have the highest responsibility of taking care of the unit. And believe me, when there is a conflict, it's not everybody who wants to run away. They can't get away because there is a family there. There is a community there. They have to be integrated. They want to stay there despite the challenges. Since 2008, every year, an average of 26.4 million people have been displaced by disasters. Most of them displaced occurred in low and middle income countries. The statistics shows us all. There are 100 million people in the need of humanitarian assistance, and out of them, a quarter of them are women and adolescent girls. Who's going to take care of them if our associations, in partnership both with the UN agencies like UNFPA, relief organizations like Red Crescent or MSP, we have to provide the support, complement the effort of the other agencies. We are an implementing agency locally owned. 85% of those displaced in 2010 in Pakistan floods were women and children. But in Pakistan, what happened, the Ministry of Defense, which is coordinating emergency, has recognized our affiliate as a partner to the government, and it's part of a committee which is there to respond to emergency situations. In Nepal, we responded within 72 hours, less than that. So, what we're saying is it's important to be responding, to recognize that camps are not an empty place where there are no people. There are souls, there are sexual activities which are taking, and women and girls need to be protected.
Thank you very much for that. Let me turn to you now. Denmark has been a global champion on these issues, and you have personally actually taken this issue close to your heart from when you started. I wanted to hear your perspective on the current challenges, not least seen in the light of the escalating conflicts and difficulties in responding to all the crisis situations in the world. What is your take on the main challenges?
First of all, let me just say that what you're telling here just make me even more proud that Denmark is a co-sponsor of IPPF and the job you're doing, especially because when you have people on the ground who have the local knowledge, it gives us an opportunity to support even better, because you have a knowledge of what is going on that we can't deliver when we come as a state agency or as an international NGO without the knowledge on the ground. So just a warm thank you for all the job you and your organization is doing. If I'm to look at what are the main crises right now, I think the problem is that there are actually so many crises and so little funding. So what you start doing is that you start with what everyone can agree is the basic needs: the housing, the food, the general health care for everyone. And what you perhaps are forgetting is what is difficult and what is not agreed upon from everyone: the sexual and reproductive health and rights, the equality among women and girls, the ways that we can have a closer cooperation. So the magnitude of the crisis we're having right now makes us focus on the beginning, and sometimes forgetting what is difficult. And even though this is, well, in Denmark, possible to have an all-party alliance on this issue, many other countries, it's highly controversial. I don't know that among the countries sitting in London right now giving money to the Syrian crisis, there are not many who can speak as freely about sexual rights as the Danes. And many will just skip this and go on to the next. So what we need to do is to make more countries realize that this is a basic, fundamental issue to have incorporated in all our efforts throughout the humanitarian crisis. We need to see this as a way of securing the other things we want to have. Because if women are not safe, if pregnancy are not safe, if some of the things that we see as basic are not there, then the other things won't come. How can a young girl be an active part of collecting firewood or collecting water if she is threatened of rape or assault in her daily work. I've been to Kakuma recently. I haven't been to the long list that the Crown Prince has been to. I've only one visit to a refugee camp, and that is scaring enough to be a lifetime memory. But in Kakuma, more than 60% of the inhabitants are younger than 18 years. There's a youth parliament there that are supposed to solve conflicts and see solutions. And one of the issues they were telling me is that when the lights are out, it's unsafe for the girls to help their families. So in order to do the basic, we need to think how to secure women and children. And I can agree on what you said, that women are a resource. I met a single mother of 7 children who has taken in 2 of her sister's children and an orphan because, well, one more or less, it didn't matter. She could handle it all. And that kind of resources we need to support. So we need to get into the notion that this is not an add-on. This is a basic fundamental issue that if we want the rest of the humanitarian aid to help and to be effective, this needs to come in as well.
Thank you. You point to some very serious challenges, both in terms of funding, in terms of magnitude of problems, but you also point to some solutions. It seems to me that some of the solutions you point to are very much at the sort of very narrow individual level, looking at the resources of the concrete women. But do you see other opportunities for taking up the dialogue with other countries? Or what are the opportunities that you see in the midst of all this horrible situation?
I see first and foremost that there is a will in the world society to take this up. This has been a core issue of the UN SDGs, where women's sexual and reproductive health and rights are still being disputed, but it's a fact, it's on the table, it's there, and we are struggling with others to make it an integrated part of what UNFPA, UNHCR, the other International Red Cross Committee are taking into them. So by taking this not only on the individual concrete level, on what we can do concrete to help a family, a young girl, but also to take it into what we're doing on the political level, at UN, at the EU, which is, by the way, not always that easy to take this issue up in the EU. We have other countries in Europe that has their problem with it. But by taking it up, by insisting that this is a target that all countries must apply with, and that we must have the targets as strong as possible within the SDGs, this is an issue that we can bring up to the table in a much more effective way than by helping one place at the time, one family at the time. But we need to do both. Because for every family we're helping, for every child we're making safe, for every time that we stop a forced and early marriage, we're giving a chance to a family to grow better. So we must do both at the same time. And I do think that this is a struggle that we have been active in for many years, and saying we, and it's not me personal, but we as Denmark and the IPPF has been active in for many years. And now we have a chance to make it a worldwide struggle, because it is on the table. And we need to make the follow-up of the SDGs coming in New York later this year a very powerful stepping point on to taking this onwards to every country, to every government around the world.
Thank you very much. So, TEWODROS, the ministers is pointing to the fact that we need to work both at the micro level and at the global level, and that we have a chance, both as Denmark and as IPPF and other friends of this agenda. What would your recommendations be? A couple of reflections in terms of recommendations both to donors and to other big humanitarian players before we invite the rest of the floor for comments and questions, please.
Thank you. I think the most important thing is the recognition that in humanitarian settings there are women and girls and they have needs on sexual reproductive health and rights. That's fundamental, because if you don't recognize the problem, if you are in denial, you can't do much. That has to be reflected in the policy of, like in the SDGs or the UN system at regional level, like, we work with the Asian parliamentarians, the African Union, and so on. How can that be reflected within that? Then at a national level, as I mentioned, for example, earlier, the Pakistani government recognized that sexual reproductive health is a component to be addressed, and it put it like an emergency response. So at the country level, there should be a recognition that is it. On the second area, I think what is important is that the donors also should be highlighting the importance of this aspect and how can it be integrated in the approach. How can there should be a synergy between the different aspects of the program. Then when we come on the ground, I think it's important to build the capacity of the local organizations, because some of these issues are very sensitive, very difficult. Unless there is a local ownership, it's very difficult to promote. The third and very critical area is really building partnership. We can't do everything. Each one of us are specialized in different areas, the different things, and so on. We are working very closely with UNFPA on the various areas, not just on the humanitarian aspect. That has to be reflected. How can we be coordinated better? We know the humanitarian agencies like Red Cross, Red Crescent, who are approaching at the local level, we are working together. In Nepal, we work together with the World Health Organization in ensuring that the quality of care, even though it is an emergency, the quality of care should be. There is something you can count on us. Two things, I don't want to go to a level of detail. One, we are locally owned. We are not the ones, I don't go from London to speak about sexual and reproductive health. In that conflict, disastrous situation, our people in Syria are there speaking. My role is to represent them, to be a catalyst. I don't speak in the name of the Syrian people. We have an association. It's locally owned. They are working with the parliament and so on. The second thing which you can count on us is that we are responsibly irresponsible. We can talk about very controversial issues which governments or some agencies cannot dare. We can speak about abortion. We can talk about rights, the women's right, gender equality. These are the things that we are brave and angry who can speak about. So let's build the partnership. That's what is critical. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for pointing to some concrete steps that we can take. Now's the time for all of you to chip in. You can have comments or make concrete questions or remarks or demand answers. The floor is yours. I think we have time for 3-4 comments, and then we'll pass the mic back to our two gentlemen up here. Let me see, there's one back there. Please state your name and organization and your question.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the great conference and the presentations. My name is Laura Kierkegaard. I'm the International Director of the Danish AIDS Foundation, also known as AIDS Funded. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by the HIV and AIDS, especially in low-income countries. This is a known fact. The risk of infection with HIV and AIDS is exacerbated very much in emergency settings, humanitarian crisis. That's also a fact. Disruption of treatment for those who are already infected and on treatment is a very risky situation for women who are supposed to be taking care of their children. Delivering babies as an HIV-infected mother without access to prevention of mother-to-child transmission involves high risk of transmitting the virus to the baby. So, enabled by donors like Denmark, the Global Fund has recently allocated an emergency fund initiative of $30 million to counteract these shortages of access to medicines and shortages in prevention in emergency situations. And I'm wondering whether the Minister will take this into account in his deliberations on the next replenishment to the Global Fund. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions or comments? This is your chance. These guys have power. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jessica Bull-Nilsson. I'm from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in England. Excuse my cold. I wouldn't want to miss this excellent conference. I wanted to ask, we talk a lot about securing women, rape of women, how to provide to their needs. I wanted to ask what IPPF does, or it's an open question really, about whether we need to also change that question around a bit and ask what can we do to challenge the men who are raping women? What can we do to engage more men and become role models in the fight for gender equality? Thank you.
Thank you. There's time for one more, yeah?
Hi, I think very inspiring speech and discussions. I'm Aditi, I'm from IPPF and I work for a program in IPPF which looks into the sexual and reproductive health in humanitarian setting. And we kind of ensure that in onset of every emergency, minimum initial service package is deployed and no one is left behind. But always we find a challenge. Of course, the minister was saying that not many countries are like Denmark coming along and supporting these issues. So we just think that is there any way the donor alliance, like everything nowadays happens in alliance, we cannot do everything alone. So is Denmark thinking of some alliance of similar thinking government coming together so that we build momentum towards supporting this kind of initiative which IPPF and other organizations are doing? Thank you.
Thank you. And is there one last one? Then this is the last comment from the floor. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is LAMA and I'm a medical student. Sorry, I have a cold as well. So, yeah. Well, my question is to Mr. Kristian Jensen. I mean, we have heard a lot about that the women and girls are like being abused in refugee camps, and we also mentioned that there's a lot of women and girls and other and boys and men who are internally displaced in Syria. I have read like a lot of articles and a lot of reports on women being arrested, detained in Syrian governmental prisons. How do we as a nation encourage or work with officials in the Syrian regime, like telling them or maybe forcing them to end these abuse of women in governmental prisons as due to the crisis? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me give the floor to you first, Minister. And we had a comment about the risk of HIV and disruption of treatment. We had one about security and how to challenge the men that actually are the aggressors. We had a point about donor alliance, and then finally the fact about women in prison and the abuse going on there. Please.
Thank you. I think what we should do most efficiently about the HIV-infected pregnant women is to make capacity building in the countries that are highly infected by HIV. Denmark is, for instance, active in Kenya, where we have shifted from giving the treatment directly until building up capacity within the Kenyan health department so that they're able to take the knowledge onwards and out and spread the good ideas and the good practices that we have helped them to build up. So by moving up the ladder from the concrete healthcare clinic to a capacity building, it's able for Denmark to reach a larger number of women and to help them. And it's actually quite successful, because it's possible to make a treatment so that they can deliver the baby without them being infected with HIV. But it demands a capability that are not there right now. So we're trying to shift it, and that's perhaps, if I could drop to your question, so to your question as well, what Denmark is doing about a donor alliance. We're actually right now in the beginning of a process where the Danish development strategy and humanitarian strategy are being looked at from a restart. With the SDGs coming on, with new possibilities of alliance around the world, we'd like to see how the Danish development aid and humanitarian aid can be interlinked. Because when we normally see them as two different sides, we're not dealing with the real world. The real world is that many humanitarian crises are long-standing and needs to have a bridge to the development side. And we should do that by building up capacity in more places. And it's a good idea to look into alliances. Denmark has an alliance with what we call the counter-terrorist initiative, where Denmark is sponsoring, together with 4 other countries around the world, an initiative to end torture. The Convention Against Torture initiative. So having those alliances gives us a better ground to stand on. Jessica, I think that we should speak more openly about the problems. This is a taboo in many places. And this is not something I say because I'm a man, but I think we should be careful of not only looking at how to punish and to go after those who rape, but also to put forward the champions that are fighting the causes of women, and to put the spotlight on and lift up and draw attention to those who are actually fighting the same fight as we are. Because not all men want this to go on. Many want to help them, us to stop it. And by putting the spotlight on the positive sides, I think we can draw attention the right way. Lama, Syria is such a horrible conflict. What's happening in Syria, what's happening with Daesh outside of Syria, in Iraq and in Syria itself, what the stories we're hearing of women is so horrible. And our problem with Syria is that our contact with the Syrian government is almost non-existent. Non-existent whatsoever. We can't get through to them. There are thousands and thousands of people on the brink of death from starvation in Syria, and they're refusing to bring in humanitarian aid. There are people who need medical attention. There are people who need attention in jails, who need education. There are so many things, and we can't get through to the Syrian government. We're trying to the EU, through the UN and through the International Syrian Support Group, to put pressure on the regime to allow this humanitarian aid. Here, Denmark really needs the alliances. We can't do it ourselves. We don't have that access to Syria, but we're trying to get it through the alliances we have around it. Because what you're pinpointing here is one of the problems, but unfortunately, just one of the far too many problems in Syria right now.
Thank you. Please, your final remarks and comments on the replies.
Thank you. I'll just, say, for example, on the issue of the HIV, STI, and so on, it's very critical to have an integrated approach, and that's what we are using, a minimum essential package. And our affiliates in the field are either working in partnership with the government for referral, for example, on providing ARV, and also on other STIs with government or with our own facilities. So it is really critical to have that integrated approach. On the issue of men, yes, we fight on the rights. We make sure that the justice system recognize that when there is a violence, when there is gender-based violence, those who are responsible have to have, the appropriate legal action against them. For that, we also need to provide training for the policemen, for the jury, because some of them, they simply don't understand. For example, in Fiji, we started a program with police officers to protect, against violence on women and so on. And it is working. There should be a men-engaged program with religious leaders. Like you saw what METTE has presented to you, what's happening in Jordan in the refugee camp, a man being committed to, convince his other peers that they have to respect the woman's rights. So it's a long battle. We have to take it at all the fronts. I think the work in prison, some of our associations have done work in prison. I can give you the example of where our association in Rwanda worked to educate the people who are, on SRH, on protecting against unwanted pregnancies. For that, there is a respect of the women. We have done that in Rwanda, in partnership with the government of Rwanda. And in Uganda, in the northern Uganda, there was a conflict. So we have worked with the government in prison, and that exchange of experiences, we have to do it with our associations in the various parts of the world. Now, when it comes to the partnership, I think it is really critical that there is a coherent approach. For example, for us, our SPRINTS program in emergency situations, sexual reproductive health, we do it with the support of the Australian government since 9 years almost. So, and we want, the Australian government is committed for a partnership, and we call upon our other donors so that there is a coordinated approach. We are working currently with DFID also in the UK so that there is the support between Australia and for the Pacific and emergency situations, but for other countries which are working in this. And that coordination, for example, we want you to reflect it in Istanbul for the humanitarian conference. I hope that Denmark is going to come at the highest level, and in partnership with our other partners who are working with UNFPA to organize a side event of talking how this, in the humanitarian setting, donors should also have a coordinated and a cohesive approach for sexual reproductive health in humanitarian setting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to both of you, and thanks to all of you for sharing and giving comments to both of these guys. Thanks a lot. We will look forward to look back in a year from now to see what some of these good solutions you pointed to, what's been happening with them. So thanks a lot to both of you. And a special thanks also to the minister, who unfortunately has other commitments and has to leave now. So now it's time to make a gender shift again. And I'm very pleased to invite two very strong women to the podium. I want to welcome first UGOCHI Daniels, who is the chief of the Humanitarian and Fragile Context branch of the UNFPA. Thanks for coming all the way from New York to us. Please come up here and join me and sit there. And then I'm very pleased also to welcome Dr. LAMA MOUAKEA, who is the Executive Director of the Syrian Family Planning Association. Dr. LAMA, please come up here. And before moving on, I just really want to take the opportunity for a specifically warm welcome to Dr. MOUAKEA. I am sure you can all imagine that it has not been easy to get a visa, to actually get all the way from Syria to Denmark. And we know that it has been a struggle, and we were actually until the last minute not sure that she could come. So I'm very, very happy that you're here. Thanks. Okay, so let me start with a couple of questions for you, UGOCHI. I think all of us know that UNFPA is, of course, working across the entire globe with sexual and reproductive health. And UNFPA also has the UN mandate to cover sexual and reproductive health in humanitarian crisis. So seen from your perspective, if you look back on the last decade, what would be your main worries when you look at the humanitarian response and how it prioritizes sexual and reproductive health? Please.
Thank you very much for a very difficult question. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at such an event. And I must use the opportunity to thank the government of Denmark for being such a strong supporter of what is a very challenging issue. So, what are my worries with regard to how the response prioritizes sexual and reproductive health? Well, my number one worry is that it does not prioritize sexual and reproductive health. That's where we start from. I was reading a report this morning, and it's a report on funding for a response. I won't mention the country, but it's a Western European country that is very supportive of the issue. And this was their analysis of their funding last year for major emergencies overall. And for a particular emergency, I know that they gave UNFPA $1 million. Now, $1 million is not a small amount of money. But when they did the analysis of their funding for the year, and there was a total, the $1 million to UNFPA, which was for SRH, came up as 0% for the overall response. $1 million came up as 0. So what does that say about prioritizing? What does it say about SRH being an afterthought? We're not living up, and when I say we, it's well, no, I shouldn't say royal because Her Royal Highness is here. I mean the we of the system. We're not living up to our commitments and promises. Every government, every UN agency, every NGO has gender equality as a priority, has reaching the most marginalized and most in need as a priority, has human rights as a priority. And yet, when it comes time to put this into action, it doesn't happen. We continue to fail women and girls. It's not acceptable that up till now, we're still talking about lighting in camps. We're talking about how latrines and toilets are being built. We're talking about access to water. We're talking about access to cooking fuel and getting food. We are consistently failing our women and girls. And we know that MDG 5 was the MDG that was least achieved. We know that for the SDGs, it is about leaving no one behind. It's a universal agenda. And yet, we are not putting this into action. But I must give a shout out to all the journalists, because I was actually in Germany for an event, and I turned on the TV, and it was the 1-year anniversary of the girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram. And in that same news piece, they featured the girls from Boko Haram and that had been kidnapped. They featured a woman in Yemen who had taken her newborn was trying to take her newborn to a health facility. They also featured a woman in Libya, actually, who was crossing the Mediterranean and had given birth. And then finally, they featured the Yazidi girls in Iraq, and we all know the story with the Yazidi girls. So when they want to depict how dire a humanitarian situation is and the personal story, it's a young woman. It's a woman with a child. It's a woman dealing with sexual violence. And yet, we're still an afterthought. So, I only had 4 minutes, but if I want to speak about my worries, I can go on for a very long time.
Well, I'm glad we have you here for the rest of the day and for the breaks and for the reception afterwards. I'm sure many people would like to hear more of your worries. I wanted to ask you to focus a little bit about one of the horrible hotspots of humanitarian crisis right now, that is the Middle East and Northern Africa. Those countries, those contexts and conflicts hit the media often, also here in Denmark, of course. Seen from a UNFPA perspective, could you describe a little bit what are some of the challenges you meet in that region?
Well, I mean, because this has been so much in the news, I think we're all very familiar with what the challenges are. I think the biggest challenge for us, and I know this is not just for UNFPA, but for all of us who are humanitarian actors, is the challenge of access. Just geographic access in such a security-compromised situation. And even when we are able to negotiate access, getting to the women and girls who are most in need of this service is particularly difficult. And even when we are able to securely access the region and when we're able to reach those most in need, because of the chronic underfunding, for us to even achieve the minimum standard of SRH services, keeping in mind SRH also includes GBV, particularly sexual violence, to even meet the minimum standards is such a huge challenge because the funding is simply not there. But let me also acknowledge Denmark here, because with funding from the government of Denmark, we've been able to produce minimum standards for addressing GBV in emergencies, in humanitarian settings. So that will go a very long way in ensuring that all of the actors working on this at least know what the minimum standards are. And everybody is trying their very best to achieve these standards, but it is a challenge. Having said all of that, it's not all, I mean, it's a lot of gloom and doom, but there are some shining examples. I'm in Zatri camp, where we are providing sexual and reproductive health services. We recently celebrated the 5,000 delivery. We've not lost a single mother in Zatri camp. We've delivered 5,000 babies. And in Syria, and I'm sure Claudia will soon speak about this, we've put in place a voucher system for women to go to health facilities that are still functioning to access services. So first of all, the women have access to the service, but with the voucher system, somehow we're contributing to sustaining the health facilities, though we recognize that there are nowhere near as many functioning facilities that there needs to be, but at least those that are there, we're sustaining access to the service as well as the facility itself, because this pays for salaries, et cetera, et cetera. In Northern Africa, the challenge of a rapidly mobile population that is not staying anywhere long enough to deliver the services that we would like to deliver is a key challenge. So what we've done, of course, is move to providing mobile services, mobile clinics, which we're able to do, and working in partnership with great partners. And then the final point I want to make is that there's this notion that because it's a humanitarian setting, you can't address gender equality, and that sexual and reproductive health, these are deep-rooted, cultural, sensitive things. You should just be giving food, tents, water, which of course you do need to give, but for all of these aspects of the response, if you do not do it if you do not do it without paying particular attention to sexual and reproductive health, you're actually doing more harm than good. If you are not putting adequate lights for women to access a latrine, you are increasing their risk and vulnerability. If you are doing food drops, where it's survival of the fittest to access the food, you are putting women at risk. If you are building shelters that in a certain place, these are female-headed households, you are putting those women at risk. So we can address these issues in the response, and you can do it in such a way that promotes gender equality. Involve women and girls in your planning, in your assessing, in how you implement, and how you design a refugee camp. Involve women and girls. So it is certainly not impossible to address these issues in these settings, and that's what we are proud that we've been able to do in our response in these areas.
Thanks for some very clear answers here and clear images, really. Now, to the difficult and to the $1 billion question, and I know this might not be so easy to answer, what does it really take to make a change that we can really feel and see, and not least women and girls on the ground can feel and see? Why is, I know this is something that everybody's working in the humanitarian settings and crisis would be asking as well, but what would it really take to get that funding in place? What would it really take to get that kind of coordination we need? What would be your take here? And please give us a little bit of hope.
That's something that Okay. That's something that keeps me awake many nights, and I always dream of having a magic wand. That if I had a magic wand, what would I do? I mean, the first thing is, you know, there used to be this expression for Nike, just do it. All of us as actors should just do what we said we're going to do in terms of the commitments that we've made to women and girls. Just do it for goodness sake, for a start. And be held and agree to be held accountable for what you've committed to do. Stop paying lip service to things that are very important and for which women and girls are bearing the brunt of not living up to commitments. So there's that broad magic wand ask. But then more specifically, on the part of donors, it's not just about more funding. I mean, more funding would certainly make a big difference, but it's also about the way funding is currently being dispersed. For every aspect of the response that you're funding, there should be a condition, criteria, whatever, to ensure that it is not putting women and girls at greater risk. There should be a criteria on how are you involving women and girls in this response. For parliamentarians should be not just voting the budget, but should be asking for presentations on the response and specifically asking about what have you done with regard to sexual and reproductive health. It is very difficult for me. You know, in the first question you asked me, you said UNFPA has the official mandate for SRH in emergencies. There is no official mandate for SRH in emergencies, if you can believe that. We have the mandate for gender-based violence, which is a component of sexual and reproductive health. Otherwise, it falls under, there's a mandate for health, which is with WHO, and WHO is a great partner of ours, but WHO is really focused on communicable diseases, which is also very important in these settings. But there is no specific, what we use the term subcluster for sexual and reproductive health within the health cluster, even though we know that this is where the majority of maternal deaths are happening. Even though we know that these women and girls are often the most marginalized, those most left behind, the most difficult to access, which is at the heart of the SDGs. I cannot think of any stronger rationale for why there should not be a subcluster specifically devoted to sexual and reproductive health of women and girls. So we definitely need this. And then for all of the humanitarian actors implementing responses, they need to mainstream, well, don't let me say mainstream, this is jargon. They need to ensure that they are not doing more harm in their intervention. They need to explicitly address issues of sexual and reproductive health in the way they plan and implement and design their programs. And I'm not going to let UNFPA off the hook here. I think even for us as UNFPA, I often get a lot of feedback that we're not as visible as we need to be. We're not raising the profile of the issue as much as we need to, which is why an event such as this is so important. So even for UNFPA, we have to do much more, as the journalists always do, to make sure that this is this gets the attention that it deserves. Because I cannot think of anything more personal to a woman or a young girl in a crisis situation who's been displaced, who her social system around her has broken down, who does not know what her future holds, and yet also not to have control of my own body in that situation. What could be more worthy, not even just worthy, more important to address in a humanitarian situation? So that's what we need to do.
Thanks for very clear answers, and I'm sure that at the World Humanitarian Summit you will repeat that, and you might find other people who will rally with you if you just scream out, just do it. So thanks for that. Okay. Let me now turn to you, Dr. Lama. You come straight from Syria, and your country is, as we've heard now, going through the most horrible crisis in the country's history. And the devastating suffering, of course, hits us every day in the media, but you live it every day. Could you please, and bear with us for only giving a few minutes for this, but could you please try to describe a little bit the situation that women and girls live? You worked with sexual and reproductive health and rights in the country for 19 years. You've seen the change, and you know what the situation is right now. Could you give us a little bit of the stories of what's going on? Thanks.
Thank you, Tania, for giving me the opportunity to give some story about Syria and the reality from Syria. Actually, I'm the Executive Director of Syrian Family Planning Association. This association was created in 1974. We are old in the country. We are providing reproductive health since we created in the country. We are focusing and we are a leader in Syria among our other NGOs by providing sexual reproductive health services. Actually, since the crisis was begun 2011, Syrian Family Planning Association actually change completely change its reality. So we start before we have a static clinic distributed all over the governorate. We expand the number of these clinics, and we start running the mobile clinic. That's because to reach the vulnerable people and people who are much in need. We developed this mobile clinic and distributed all over the country. We saw that the people, women and girls, very much in need, and we couldn't reach them. We can reach them not only in the shelters. They are hosted, the displaced people inside the country. They are displaced from the other damage governorate. So they are hosted in the community, in other more safe communities. So you found that the family are integrated in some communities which make this community are affected. So the mobile clinic our association are going to these vulnerable places to provide sexual and reproductive health. And we add specific services such as in our static clinic, such as psychosocial support, legal support, counseling, and psychosocial support to respond to the GBV cases. We found during our experience that when women found a service, good quality of service in our clinics, they remain to coming back and back to have the services. So you can say that the issue when you provide good quality of services in the clinic or in the mobile clinic, they feel that the woman can continue coming and feel safe to stay in the community and benefit of the service if it's in good quality. So our association with cooperation with the UN agency and with the government, we create a lot of creative projects targeting women and girls. We opening like a women safe spaces in our clinic, in the whole of the clinic to provide vocational training for women for their income generating. Because, you know, the income generating, in the absence of the husband, the woman will be exposed to many she will be vulnerable and she exposed to a lot of abuse and suffering from absence of income generating. So we create this woman safe space actually under budget of funding of the UNFPA. This will give a chance to women, for the women to create their local income and feel safety for their situation. In the same clinic, with in the safe women safe spaces, we create the counseling for psychosocial, and we detect many GBV cases according in our clinics. Actually, when we make a legal counseling and legal follow-up for some cases of rape and other situation of for women, we found a lot of you know, as I mentioned for you, that when you provide the woman very quality of care for women and reach the woman where they are not able to come to your static clinic, for running the mobile clinic is very good, successful story to achieve the woman and girl, because they are suffering a lot.
Thanks for that. I know you told me last night that the cases of domestic violence is also a very ignored issue in humanitarian crisis, because the general tendency that and what's covered in media is very much the aggressors being soldiers or being all kinds of sort of external men, but in fact domestic violence is very much a tabooed and or ignored issue. Could you explain why is it that domestic violence is rising in Syria, and what can be done about that?
Tanya, that's true, Tanya. Domestic violence, you couldn't find a woman come to the clinic declare that I'm suffering of domestic violence. We have to follow the cases. We have to reach the woman and to follow the cases. How we do that in our association? Actually, to facilitate access to the woman in the marginalized places and go to vulnerable area, you can detect, and how you can detect the capacity building for the staff in the association is very a big issue to building the capacity on minimum package of it was called MISP. It's minimum initiative for sexual reproductive health package, and how to deal with rape cases. You have to detect the rape cases by the following the examination. If the gynecologist examine any sign of rape, so she can refer to the other counseling services integrated in the clinic. Repeat to say that if a woman have a safe space to go and to give her a good chance to express her feeling and giving her confidentiality to give her problem. No one will announce about her problem. She will be very free to give her story and her circumstance. Actually, when we are in Syria, we found even there is a very change in circumstance. We suffer a lot in our association that our mobile clinic is going outside and to follow the community, the patient in the community. But sometimes this road is today is working. It's safe to pass this road. Tomorrow, the next day is not safety. So there is a change. There is no electricity, no sometimes no water for the people in the communities. So there is no straight environment. So we have to deal always with these changes. In addition to that, the staff is sometimes damaged because of the war. Some of staff, they are traveling outside Syria. So continuously we have to manage and to we have to manage the changes and to accept and work with law circumstances are available. So this need a creative way to meet the demand, the very high demand of the woman and girl in the country. So to meet this demand, you have to be more flexible in dealing with this exchange environment and more trust. Actually, our association, because it was old and we have trusts from other UN agency and from the government, so we have available many channels to build the cooperation with people, with the community, to achieve our services. So, I don't know if you know, I want to ask any question else.
Thank you so much, and thanks for being there and staying in those difficult circumstances. And I want now to give the chance to all of you to ask specific questions for Dr. Lama or broader questions about the humanitarian work of UNFPA to UGOCHI Daniels. So please, the floor is open. I can see we have a first question here. Please introduce yourselves and where you come from.
Yeah, METTE GJERSKOV from here, from the Parliament. So, well, first of all, I think to say to you, Dr. Lama, that you should know, and please bring the message back from Denmark, that you are not forgotten, and that your people is not forgotten. I think that's very important to say. I could hear from you say, do no harm. That's where we should start. Do no harm for women and children. I mean, that's what doctors learn the first day they go to school. So, but TEWODROS talked about local communities and how we can build strong networks. And actually, that's what you're doing as well, Dr. Lama, about having these strong networks. Because one thing is in the camps, or the refugee centers, we know at least what to do. Maybe we don't do it, but we know what to do. But most refugees actually live outside the camps, either internally displaced like in Syria, or in other countries where they are maybe not even legal residents. So this makes women even more vulnerable, and children as well. So when they lose their extended family, their personal network, their neighbors, what can we do? How can we organize making those networks for these women? I mean, outside the camps. This is not an easy question. And that's why I ask it, because I haven't got the answer. So, please.
Thank you. There was on the third row.
Hi, thank you. My name is Yıldız Akdogan. I'm also a member of the Parliament and Social Democrat and colleague to METTE. Thank you both for your very interesting speech. My question is to Dr. Lana. I know it's maybe not that easy for you to describe also the internal conflict, but maybe you can somehow comment a little bit on it. Is it difficult to, when you go and try to help the women, do you somehow sometimes also get in conflict with the different ethnic groups? Or, I mean, can you reach all women, or are there some problems when you are trying to work with women in general? Could you maybe comment on that, just to give us also an inside view of how difficult maybe your work actually is inside the country? Thank you.
Well, actually, it's more of a comment, because I was working in Syria until May this year, and working with Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and the biggest question we had all the time from volunteers was how to address sexual and gender-based violence. And the need is really there for training material and a lot of allocation for money for training, because they were witnessing it every day, and they were really in dire need of how do we address it. And we need many more people to be able to do that, to train and training materials, etc. So it was more of a comment. I heard the need on a daily basis.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Hi, this is Riva Eskenazi from IPPF. Dr. Lama, thank you again very much for being here and sharing with us your experiences. What I wanted to ask you is, from your concrete experiences in Syria, what may be the top 2 or 3 recommendations you may have on how we should be strengthening our response on SRHR violations occurring in humanitarian settings? Thank you.
Let's take one more before we close. One down there in the back.
Thank you. Gert Elmark from Dignity, Danish Institute Against Torture. I have a question and perhaps also a small comment. My question is in regards to the point that I think one of our colleagues made on women in prison, the issue of of human rights violations that amount to torture, whether you see that there's a slight risk of engendering human rights violations by considering issues of torture under the umbrella of sexual and reproductive health when it comes to war zones and very difficult dialogues where we might have to address the violations in a more precise language, and whether it applies as much to men and women, this risk of considering sexual violence rather than torture in the cases where that's what it amounts to. And then secondly, I just wanted to comment our colleague who asked about what's the situation of women in prison. At the Women Deliver conference, we have a side event on women in prison on the 17th of May, where the Assistant General Secretary of Human Rights has confirmed his participation. So there will actually be a specific side event addressing that question. I hope as many as possible will join into that.
Thank you very much. Now I'll turn to our two panelists, and just recapping quickly that there was the issue of how to actually organize those networks and alliance building on the ground. There was a particular question for you about difficulties regarding access to certain groups, or difficulties in general in doing your work on the ground, ethnic groups or other issues. And then there was confirmation of the issue of gender-based violence in Syria, confirming what we've already heard. And then there was a specific ask for your top 2 recommendations about what to do on the ground. And finally, the dilemmas involved with the nominations of sexual violence. Is it sexual violence or is it torture? Let me ask you, Dr. Lama, to begin, please.
The first issue that asking me about the difficulties and how we can reach the women. In Syria, we are not only the association who is working with the women. We are working in cooperation with other NGOs, local NGOs and UN agencies. But during the crisis, we increased a lot of our services provided to the community, especially for women and girls. The difficulties is actually the changes circumstance along the country, and how we can manage the changing of this circumstance. But in our experience, we found that the mobilizing the community and raising their awareness on the importance of sexual reproductive health and violence, this will help the association or any sector working on this field to be more, to facilitate their work. Actually, to deliver a hotline for women, if you want, it's a hotline for abused women or something like this. It needs many effort. It needs many raising awareness for the community to use these facilities. So to reach more women. I want to tell you something. We are association. We determined to stay in Syria and to provide the women. Why we want to provide women? Because we feel that when the community feels safety, they will stay in Syria. They will not go outside Syria. And to serve the people inside Syria is much better to serve them in the camps, because there is many different issues and needs in the camp, and more expensive to serve them outside Syria. So how we can leave these people and push them to stay in Syria, if we provide them a safety and good quality of services, they can stay in Syria. So our role in Syria to move the women from hopeless to hopeful, so they can stay in Syria. So actually, our messages and our all activities is to relieve them community, especially girls and women who are the most affected people in the community, to provide them with good quality of services and reach them all with these services. And for the top, actually, for the top recommendation, we found during our experience that addressing sexual and reproductive health is a very critical issue, and we need to clear focus on prevention and protection. So we have to deliver more services under protection and prevention issue, and strengthen the system that the sexual gender-based violence can be prevented in the first place. So, and we need more support from the communities. We need more raising awareness about this, the gender-based violence issue, and more mobilization of the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to you for a few last 2 minutes reply, please.
Mic, okay, it's on. It's hard to do justice to this topic in the amount of time that we have, but let me just try and answer these questions as quickly as I can. So on the comment about do no harm and how do you organize women and girls that are not in a camp setting, I had made the comment about involving women and girls and how you plan, design, assess the response. They will tell you, or they'll tell us, how to actually go about doing it. I mean, there's a very famous example from Liberia, the war in Liberia, and how the women organized themselves through their church and the mosque, and actually played a very key role in bringing that conflict to an end. They know their social systems and their social structure and how to tap into that during response. And something that we often forget is that the greatest resource is the affected population themselves. So to recognize that this is your greatest resource, and they have their own innate resilience and coping mechanisms, and that's what we want to maximize and see how to best leverage for an effective response. On the issue about capacity building, as far as I'm concerned, there's no area where there's a greater need than when it comes to managing sexual violence. Even for the easiest aspect of it, which is the medical response. In most medical schools, it's not part of the curriculum how to provide treatment for a rape survivor. And then there are a whole range of other services a survivor would need. Unfortunately, capacity building is not one of the sexy activities that gets funded. It doesn't have, I'm not saying anything here that you don't already know, but capacity building is what, we as the UN, it's a core pillar of what it is that we do and we try and do with our partners. Particularly for Syria, what we have tried to do, of course, given the challenges of access, has been through the cross-border operations and actually doing the capacity building on the Turkish side, rather, because we can't actually do capacity building right now within Syria to the extent that we would normally do. On the issue of violations and impunity, this is a very tricky issue for us. What our experience has shown from several conflicts, particularly where it's a protracted conflict, is that it's very hard to address impunity while the conflict is ongoing. You need to do it much after. In fact, I was having an interview with a journalist this morning, and we were talking about the situation in Guatemala for rapes that happened 30 years ago, where the legal process is just going through now. So that's one. And the focus is always on the safety of the survivor. So if oftentimes the push for addressing violations is not from the survivor that is pushing it. It's often from us who feel so affronted that human rights have been violated so gravely and so grotesquely that we feel that this must happen. But the focus really needs to be on giving the survivor what he or she needs. And what the evidence shows is, number one, the first thing is, of course, the medical service, and then psychosocial support. If the survivor decides that at a certain point there will be, she will seek legal redress, then it's important for documentation. But we typically don't push for processing a legal process while the conflict is ongoing. On the issue of whether to keep it under sexual violence or under torture, I mean, rape is already considered in the international standards, international treaties. Rape is already considered a form of torture, and it's also considered something that cannot be, given amnesty when they're doing their truth and reconciliation, well, whatever their transition process is. I used to be at one stage in my UNFPA in Nepal and even in the Philippines, where both of them have had protracted crises. And the challenge was, while deaths, there were certain violations which were not covered under amnesty, which were covered for compensation because they were considered grave violations. Rape was not, and we were doing a lot of advocacy for it to be included. So it's not so much whether we treat it under sexual violence or whether we treat it under torture that is what the barrier is for it being treated properly. It has more to do with the national actor and how we, not the royal we, how we as the system working on this continue to hold them accountable based on all the international treaties, which all of them have signed at one point or the other. And just a final point on women in prison. An interesting example from the Ukraine, when I visited the Ukraine, we actually used HIV as the entry point for gaining access to this population. So it's almost each, I mean, we're speaking here in generalities, but almost each and every crisis is a different context, and you need to figure out what the effective strategy is to gain access to the population, to gain access to the women and girls most in need.
Those were the final words, and I want to thank both of you so much for coming here, and please forgive us for the short time for these important points you brought to us. So thanks again to both of you so much. Thank you so much. Now there comes a time in every conference where the body doesn't want to sit in the chair anymore and the mind starts flying out of the window. This time is now, and what that means is coffee. Okay, so in 1 second we will go out and have 10 minutes of a coffee break, but please also be mindful of time and be back here in 10 minutes. But before you all leave, I just want to once more thank Her Royal Highness for being with us. I know you have other commitments after the break, so please just join me all in a warm thanks to you again. So, all of you, please go outside and have some coffee and some snacks and refresh the mind.
Skal du være hurtig?
Okay, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed the coffee. I can certainly hear that some brain cells started functioning better than just before the break. Yes. Some cells. Okay. So I'm happy to welcome you all back. We are now entering into the last session of today's conference, and we have a panel discussion tabled here. So I'm very pleased to introduce our three panelists. The first one is CLAUS HAUGAARD. He's the Senior Advisor at the European Political Strategy Center at the European Commission, but he was also the former Director General of ECHO, the European Commission's Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection Department. So he knows about EU's humanitarian programs. So over here with the red tie, we have Anders LADEKARL, who is the Secretary General of Danish Red Cross. And then we have Martin Lidegaard, who is the former Minister for Foreign Affairs and now Member of Parliament of the Social Liberal Party. So welcome to all three of you. Unfortunately, we had illness of our fourth panelist, who was BIRGITTE QVIST-SØRENSEN, the Secretary General of Danish Church Aid. She sends greetings. So, Klaus, I would like to begin with you for a European perspective on these issues. So as the Director General for ECHO, could you, as a former Director General of ECHO, of course, could you give us a little bit of perspective of how the European Union looks upon this and how you worked with the issue of sexual and reproductive health in humanitarian aid?
Well, thank you very much, and really good to be here today. And I have to say, I was very impressed that the Crown Princess stayed in the whole of the first session. It's very rare that you have a Crown Princess that stays long. It's even more rare that you have one that has been in 4 refugee camps, and because that's where you learn what is going on. And I would even add, you also learn it outside of the refugee camps, because a lot of the victims are actually spread in the population, and we don't exactly know what is going on out there. But let's not fool ourselves. It's clear that sexual and reproductive health, together with the whole protection issue, is one of the most challenging issues in humanitarian settings. It's, I shouldn't say so, but it's somehow easier to deal with food security, somehow easier to construct some shelter and to get some water. But the real difficult issues are those that are full of politics and full of cultural differences and full of emotions and hidden in the populations. So it's very tricky. And I would very much agree that the fact that there's not a specific mandate and that we don't have a subcluster in this area is a problem. Already, we have to admit that the health cluster is one of the most dysfunctional clusters in the whole humanitarian architecture. I'm not saying anything new. I'm a member of the advisory group to Margaret Chan. We just delivered our report beginning of January on how she has to reform her organization because we need that. And had I had this knowledge today, I would actually have made an extra point in talking about subclusters. So it's something that I would want to take up with Margaret when I see her next time. So what do we do at the level of the European Union? I mean, first of all, we try in ECHO in Brussels to be a federator among all the member states, so that we develop policies in very many different areas that we share, we discuss, we disseminate, so that we bring professionalism into this world. And gender issues, gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive rights have been fairly high, and it has been sort of climbing up our list of priorities. Now, it is not a sector that you can isolate from other clusters. I mean, it is very much an approach that has to be integrated into how we deal with water and sanitation, how we deal with shelter and camp management, how we deal with protection in general, because it's intertwined. And this is what makes it a challenge. What we have done very concretely a year and a half ago, it was difficult because we wanted to do it right, is to establish a gender marker, which is then equipped with a manual where you have all the different components of the problem. And then we tell our partners, because we are a donor, so we enter into contractual relationships, we tell them, okay, before we sign off on this contract, you have to tell us how you have factored in the gender aspects, including the sexual and reproductive health issues. And obviously, in very many situations, it's not relevant, so they score a 0. They don't like that too much. People don't like to get a 0 in your notebook. I mean, you have to present it to your board and so on. But what I have seen over the last 12 to 18 months is that increasingly the fact that you put it into the contractual relationship actually ups the stakes. People have to do more, and they come back and they say, okay, how do we do it? Then, so you have the stick. It's not a very brutal stick, but it is a stick. So there's some kind of accountability, and then it's about knowledge. So we are actually also rolling out courses and learning programs so that people get to know what is this about. I mean, what are they talking about when they want a latrine that is properly illuminated, that you need lights, you know, when you make food distribution, you have to bloody watch out if the men are just stealing the food from the babies. I mean, I've seen it, you have seen it with our own eyes, what is going on in these places, in nutrition stations and so on. So there has to be a lot of knowledge transfer, and from there, I think we can push the agenda slowly towards something that is more sensible. I just got the latest draft report of the Secretary General for the Istanbul meeting, and I was very happy that the Crown Princess mentioned that. And if you read paragraph 94 to 99, the issue is there. And now it's about organizing the advocacy in the run-up to Istanbul, because if you get it right, there will be a lot of noise around this issue. One of the high-level roundtables is about women and girls. It's called Leadership and Empowerment. I like that, actually, because I don't want women and girls always to be seen as victims, but I want the whole approach to be an empowerment approach. Use the resources of what we call the weak sex. I don't believe in that, no, but I mean, use the resources, make sure you engage them. So at the highest level in Istanbul, there will be attention to this. And now it's a question of getting organized and rolling it out and putting this squarely on the agenda. Sorry for having been a little bit too long, but.
Thanks for that. I have two follow-up questions for you. The first one has to do with the zero score and the contracts. Is it, or was it possible to still have a contract with ECHO if you had a zero score in your gender analysis? And would that come with any kind of comments or recommendations for the contractee? And the second question would be regarding the World Humanitarian Summit. Some people say or feel that is what the dialogue and the roundtables and the attempt to bring really high-level decision makers to that summit, is that accountable enough? Are the accountability mechanisms surrounding that summit enough, or is there a risk of that summit being just talks?
Listen, if we pass a contract with the World Food Programme for lorry transport of foodstuff, I'm not going to kick them out if they score a 0 in gender. I mean, there are situations where it's not really that relevant. Let's be honest about it. I could mention other types of that sort. But if it comes to nutrition and feeding stations, then it's smack in the center, because that's where you have all the women coming with their babies, you have the men standing outside, and there's a lot of tension in the area. They steal, some of the girls are raped, some of the girls, you send them back to their village, and it just starts all over. So it's completely idiotic not to have a very strong component of sexual and reproductive health in those contracts. And I can tell you that actually one of the strengths of ECHO is that we have a lot of experts out there in the field. They are sent out there, they stay out there, they're actually experts in each of their domain, and they go after the projects and check what is actually being done. So we get a lot of granular detail feeding back to headquarters, and then regularly we have a political dialogue with the main operators and the main NGOs, and we say, hey, what happened? I mean, why didn't you deliver, or was there something? Not to bash, it's not about bashing, it's about holding hands and improving the system. It's what I call a little bit tough love, if you see what I mean. Yeah, sometimes they don't like it too much, but I mean, then we soften a bit. So it's not like a light switch, like, okay, you scored 1, we switch off the light, because we don't want to lose the project, but it's a process. In my view, it's actually more intelligent like that. On the World Humanitarian Summit, accountability, not accountability, clearly it is not a summit like the climate change summit or like the New York SDG or Sendai. We are not aiming, the Secretary General is not aiming at a negotiated text because perhaps it was the first summit of its kind. It's the first humanitarian summit ever. That's why we have to make it a success. But it's so full of very nasty politics that I think collectively there was a fear that if we got into a very sort of UN-style negotiation, it will all get bogged down. But it doesn't mean that the level of ambition should not be high. It is absolutely essential that from Istanbul we get a call for decency and political leadership to get to the roots of some of these problems. The roots are political. They are also failed development, etc., but they are, if you look at Syria, and you know what I'm talking about, it's a political root cause that we have there. So there has to be this call, and the more NGOs and the more people from stakeholders that can be in Istanbul speak out on the enormity and the disastrous situation we have, the better. Then we will see afterwards what we harvest will have to go in different boxes. Some of the issues will have to go back to New York, to the General Assembly. Some other issues will have to go to the agencies in their governing boards. They have to change their way they do business. I would like to see a programmatic approach. I would like to have common needs assessment. I have a whole list of things I want to see done. And other things can just be done by people exchanging experience. So accountability, let's be critical, but let's make it a success. I think that's actually the biggest challenge.
Thank you. Now, I want to turn to you now, Anders LADEKARL. I'm quite sure that you didn't get a 0 in your ECHO applications because I know that you work with sexual and reproductive health. So I was wondering if you could start by just explaining a little bit about what does the Danish Red Cross actually do? What kind of approaches do you support? Please.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I firstly will have to apologize myself. I'm a practitioner. I've been engaged with the emergency relief for 25 years. And I tend to try to reality check buzzwords and nice intentions. I would also love that today, if we really want to influence the way we deal with sexual and reproductive health in emergencies, that we actually brought a different audience. Not to criticize the audience we have, but if we really want to make a change, then it should be the relief cowboys of this world who actually should be present here today, and who would then reality check some of the very nice words that actually has been coming from this podium. I would love that our work was about doing no harm. But my God, my reality is filled with daily dilemmas in doing less harm than good. We are not in this privileged situation always to be able to be sure that we do not do harm. 2 weeks ago, we were finally allowed, together with colleagues from the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, to be allowed into METTE. We had negotiated for months to get a convoy in there. We were not allowed to decide what should be on that convoy. We were not allowed to evacuate hungry people, hungry children out of that city. We were allowed to bring in foodstuff. We were not even sure that this food would actually get to those who were starving in that city. We could do harm, and we were doing harm to some. But were we doing more good than harm? Yes, we thought so. And that was why we decided to go. And that's the dilemma that we are facing every single day in disasters like Syria, in disasters like Yemen, and in disasters like Afghanistan. And it's not just about programming with the necessary lights for latrines and with separated areas for women. Because most of those who are displaced in emergency situations, they are, like Mette was saying, they are not based in camps. They are based in their shelters, in basements, in unfinished buildings, in scattered tents, wherever they can find shelter. So this very easily programmatic approach of just doing right is very difficult actually to implement in real life. Does that mean that we should not attempt to do better? Of course not. But when people are not living in tents, when most of those who actually are implementing humanitarian relief are nationals, are local colleagues, which are just as much influenced by their culture as those we are trying to serve, we have to take the point of departure of the situation of the country and the culture that we are working in. So I disagree that culture doesn't matter. It matters a lot. Doesn't mean that we have to accept culture, but we have to challenge something that is far greater than just an emergency situation. So for the Danish Red Cross and for the Red Cross in general, this is a very complicated issue which is multifaceted and which has to take into departure the provision of fundamental basic services. And I very much agree with CLAUS that this is an issue that has to be integrated, that has to be sort of cross-cutting in what we're doing. In Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, the access to basic health is and must be our first priority. I would say 80% of all doctors and qualified health personnel in Syria has disappeared from the country. 2/3 of all health infrastructure has been destroyed. The access to basic health care is not present for 80% of the population. So we have to focus on making that possible as the first step. And it's not easy. I myself, a couple of years ago, visited MOUAKEA, which is one of the suburbs to Damascus, a now entrenched suburb. We had a small clinic, a clinic in a basement, where the only access to get there was through an alley of snipers, where the volunteers were working and living in that quarters. People were just concerned about getting into the clinic and out as fast as possible because they were being killed on the road. First priority was to get safe access to healthcare. And for us, this is priority number one when it comes to reproductive health. Access and availability in Afghanistan and in Yemen and in Syria is the number one issue. Number two issue is, of course, then when we have that access to Plan Smart. And Plan Smart is just about taking all the knowledge we have, and we have the knowledge, and we have the training, and we know what to do in this situation, and Plan Smart, what we should do anyhow. But then again, we're up against cultures as well, because in the Red Cross, well, it's domestic staff, it's local volunteers who also have to be argued with, which have to be where we have to do advocacy and work on issues which they normally in their culture may not have very high on their personal agenda. When it comes to gender-based violence, yes, we see a huge increase in gender-based violence in conflict situations. And it very often goes with impunity, and that's also why it's in the increase. Again, we have to address not only the conflict situation, but the root causes. And if we do not work with gender-based violence also as a long-term issue where you have to address cultural behaviors, then you're not going to make a lot of differences. So what I'm saying is, this is not necessarily about not doing harm. It's tough choices, and it's about addressing cultures, and it's about smart planning under very, very difficult circumstances where you always will be faced with priorities of life and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders, for really highlighting the very, very tough choices and dilemmas that you live with and work with every day, and particularly highlighting the difficulties in the immediate response, which I think you very clearly described. I was wondering, you mentioned before that the emergency cowboys should have been here. And I was wondering, based on your decade-long experience, what would you take on how to get those emergency cowboys to actually attend this kind of conference? Would it be a matter of really focusing narrowly on the immediate emergency response? Or what would your recommendation or take be on how to get those people interested in this topic?
I think firstly it has been a great help that CLAUS and ECHO and donors really has put this issue on the agenda, because if there's no money, then there's no action. So that's a very, very practical way of dealing with it. I actually also think that the concept of doing no harm, even though I was critical about the issue as such, has the idea of discussing doing more good than harm has been really important to bring this case forward. And then I think the advocacy often starts with ourselves. We might be those who actually understand the issue, but bringing people who actually are the implementers to the table and advocate with ourselves in the first place might be a very good starting point. We have manuals, we have sphere standards, I think we have everything that we need, but we in our daily life, and I think some of my colleagues will be able to explain more about that, will have to argue with our volunteers, with our colleagues, that this is very important, and that this should be an integrated part of what they're doing when they are concerned about bringing the next truck and securing that there is food enough to be delivered, and so on and so forth. So everything will start with advocating amongst ourselves.
Okay, thanks for that. Now I would like to turn to you, Martin Lidegaard, former Minister of Foreign Affairs. When you were minister, you actually launched the Danish National Action Plan on the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. A very important resolution, and Denmark playing an important role in taking that work forward. Could you explain to us why was that work important for you as a minister, and what was your experience with that?
Well, I don't think I have to explain the audience here why that is important. It's obvious that even though Claus is very right, I think, saying that to some extent it's a very difficult issue to deal with, it's to some extent more difficult than food and shelter and water supply. It's also obvious that it is equally important because it is determining whether the things we are trying to do in the refugee camps and all the crisis situation actually will be sustainable, and whether we, by the end of the day, will be able to provide a future and a hope for the people, for the women, but also for the children and the men, for a situation and a life which will improve their situation. And it's obviously also a problem which is growing in substance and in quantity, and therefore it's obviously also extremely important to deal with it politically.
Yeah, so what, now looking at
all the challenges we've seen today, we've heard about today, and looking at the magnitude of crisis going on right now, what do you think should be Denmark's role in this field moving forward? And what would your recommendations be for donors and big humanitarian players?
Yeah, maybe I should start by thanking you for making the conference, because I think it is extremely important to have these kind of discussions and to be better and to learn. And I think that if I should add to the donor, the big donor perspective from CLAUS and the practical, perspective from Anders, I could take a more national perspective, saying which difference could Denmark make, and a small country like Denmark make, if we were to do something more than we do today. And of course we have our role in the EU and to support their efforts. We have our role in being a donor also to Red Cross and other NGOs who are doing an excellent job out there. And I would say I agree with Klaus, both on when it comes to we have to mainstream it and put it in the contracts and ensure that we have this as a part of our integrated efforts. I also agree when it comes to the knowledge part, to make noise and advocacy, and that's where events like this come in and are very important, as well as I think it's extremely important to recognize the dilemmas that you are dealing with on a practical basis, Anders. And if I sum up all that, it gives me an idea that might be difficult, but maybe could be something that a country like Denmark could and should work more with than we have done. Because what you're actually saying is that sometime your role in the camps, in the crisis, makes it very difficult for you to take a direct approach in some of these situations, because you have to deal with some of the local authorities or even just tribe leaders or whatever it might be that are not respecting this agenda to the same degree, to put it mildly. And what do we do in that situation? Because there you become the authority, suddenly, on behalf of your donors, even though you're not a political, you are in political and all that, and independent. I'm just thinking, is there a room, and is there, there's not one obviously solution to this. We are talking about very different situations in different, wars and conflicts. What I'm thinking about now, presenting this idea, is talking about the more established refugee camps where millions of people are living both close to Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan these days, and where there is shelter, there is basic health care, but still a lot of problems. Maybe it would be an idea to introduce in some of these very, very big camps where people are living for years, that we have a voice, a tent, a place where girls, children and women can go, which is not Red Cross, if it's you drinking that camp. It's not the authority. It is a free room, so to speak, where you can go, get advice, get shelter for a shorter period of time if you are in an emergent situation, which could make it both possible to bring some relief to the life of these people, but also to enable us ourselves to understand exactly what is going on. It's not to compare, but when I'm thinking about, it took a very long time in Denmark before we actually provided what I would call kind of relief to mostly women with another ethnic background in Denmark who were forced into marriage but didn't want to, and who had to leave their families in order to get out of that marriage. And we saw in the last 2 to 3 years, as far as I know, a quite big increase in numbers of girls taking that opportunity, fleeing to a center or somehow getting out of that situation. That might be because that we have an increased number of forced marriage, or we have an increased number of girls or women who don't want to go into a forced marriage or getting the courage or the backup to do it. But it might also just be because they can't do it. they can actually go to a place and get assistance and get advice to how they get out of this. It's difficult to compare the situation, but I'm just thinking about that maybe we need a third part, something that is relieving you from your dilemma, where people could go if they feel so, and where we could maybe also pick up. So, if it wasn't for, and I will, since there's no governmental party in the panel, I will not be too critical, that's not fair, though the government is represented. But of course, we say that if we were in a situation where we wouldn't cut all our development assistance and cut what we're doing in gender and also in this specific area on sexual and reproductive health, this could be an area we could consider, I think, to make an offensive on. It would place Denmark, I think, in a critical role because we are already very active in refugee camps. We are very respected. You are doing a fantastic job out there, and therefore I think it would be very obvious for us to take such a role as maybe also bringing something new to these camps, which could be a direct line of assistance to these people.
Thank you for a very concrete proposal. Now is the time where all of you can have remarks, comments, questions, input to the panelists, to each other. So let's please take at least 2 rounds of comments. There's one down there. And please remember to say who you are and where you come from.
Thank you very much. My name is Lene Poulsen and I'm an independent consultant. For the gender age marker of ECHO, that many organizations have applied now, I think it's important to look at it also because it looks at what are the negative impacts that this particular funding is doing. But I think it's much more important to see how can we make sure that humanitarian assistance in general look at sexual and SRH rights in general, and not just to, because it's easy to say that my project does not do any harm, but to see what does it do to actually promote in general, because we know it's a general problem. That's one thing. The other thing is how do we avoid that it becomes a checkbox that we say, okay, we have looked at that. I looked at a huge project last year. It was funded, and we are talking about $800 million, and it had a gender mark of 3, which should be impossible. And nobody had ever questioned that before. So, and everybody said, okay, it's fine, they're doing well, and the gender mark goes from 0, 1, and 2, but this one had a 3. And again, how do we really avoid that it becomes much more? So it's again maybe, how do you make sure that you have a continuous capacity development component of these issues, so we continue to talk about it among the humanitarian people at all levels. And that brings me to another issue that is, I have worked in this field of development and humanitarian assistance for many, many years, many decades now. And I have seen in many organizations also that there are sexual abuse within the organizations when you come out to the field. And it's something that is not talked about. And it's something when we go in for evaluations that they say, no, 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 please don't, this is not what you're evaluating. And I think it should be kept separated from the operational side, but I think it's something that needs much more attention. And also when you go to Istanbul, I think it's something that needs to be taken up there. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a comment or question here from IPPF's director.
Thank you. This is TEWODROS from IPPF. I think from what I hear, I understand perfectly the challenges that Anders has put, that when there is an emergency situation, when you have a mandate, when it's in a conflict situation, it might be difficult for one organization to compromise what it has to do immediately, given all the challenges. But I think what all of us, and the UN also, is how can we create a complementary role of the different organizations? We can't expect, for example, in every situation, the Red Crescent does every single thing of what is required in emergency, especially when it is a delicate situation. But there are organizations like us. The UNFPA is doing in population family planning. The UN can put its acts together by saying, okay, here is the mandate. In such kind of situation, you do that, this organization will do that, and so on. And within the civil society, we can also partner and complement the effort of each other so that what the valuable thing that each one is bringing is there, but it is not overshadowing what it has to do or put into the risk. I think that's something which has to be explored, and what is the means of really making this partnership and cooperation more effective and at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there one more comment or? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Aditi. I'm from IPPF Humanitarian Program. My specific question is to CLAUS. ECHO probably the biggest humanitarian donor. And I understand that you talk about mainstreaming SRH into the program. That's fantastic, probably. That's the way we all want to go. But I just wonder from my experience working with ECHO funding, with different other organizations as well, that, in the name of mainstreaming, sometimes the probabilities get diluted a bit. And so I was just wondering if you have some kind of analysis of percentage of ECHO funding goes towards implementing MIS, Minimum Initial Service Package for Reproductive Health, which is now a acknowledged standard by SPHERE and ISAC also. So do you have any such analysis? Because that probably can really bring the agenda forward within ECHO. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's just have some quick responses from the panel. There was the questions about the gender marker and how we avoid the checkbox approach, the need for continuous capacity building, and then the very serious issue of the sexual abuse by the organizations actually working in this field. Then the complementarity role of the organizations, and lastly, EU approach to MISP. I don't know, Klaus, do you want to start?
Yeah, with pleasure. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. We can make all kinds of boxes that we have to tick, and if there's no follow-up, if it's not combined with a training and accountability procedure, it will just be ticking, and then we lose it. I'm not so surprised that there have been mistakes made in the beginning. After all, the marker was only instituted, I think, 18 months ago, or maybe 2 years ago. Time is running, but it's in the process of being rolled out. And I can tell you that my people are actually following it very carefully. I mean, there's reporting coming in, and they are trying to assemble all of that and to see how has it actually changed the behavior on the ground. But nothing is perfect. I mean, we have to be always behind everybody to get it done. On the abuse, which is a real issue, and there has been, I think, some kind of uneasiness in actually dealing with that. ECHO is right now financing a contract with the IOM to go into details on what can be done to come to grips with the abuse of the behavior of aid workers, and to establish codes of conduct, and to make sure that everybody signs up to that kind of solemn promise that they would not do this kind of stuff. So it's something that is definitely on our radar screen, and I think it's perfectly logical to bring that issue to Istanbul, because it's not only the soldiers that are doing it. I mean, we know it's always dangerous when you have 10 men in one place. Strange stuff happens. So we really have to be very, very careful. No, I'm sorry. I mean, on the coordination, which was raised, one of the issues I think the whole humanitarian system has been struggling with has been the lack of synergy between the different parts of the system. I mean, it's the agencies, I say it with all the love and respect I have for a number of these agencies, but they are not good at talking to each other. And the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, is trying to do it, but that's at the top level, so it's Antonio Guterres and Etherin Cousin and the others. But then it has to drill down, and they actually have to cooperate in the field. So you need authority for the humanitarian coordinator in a given country to create coherence. And that could also provide an avenue for introducing this particular subject, because otherwise it will fall between a number of chairs and you would never have accountability. But that could actually help. And it's some of the issues that the Secretary General has put in his report. In my view, it's too weak. We still have to push it further, but there's really scope to do something there. And there was a last question to ECHO, but I have forgotten it. But you remember everything.
It was about the sphere guidelines and ECHO's approach to the MISP.
Ah, yes. I have to study that, how they actually are improving. I have a bunch of experts back home. I will send the message to you. Give me your email, and then you'll get an answer. Okay? I prefer to be honest. I don't know everything.
We appreciate honesty. Martin, do you want do you have a few comments?
I don't have much to add. I think actually the questions were directed at the two gentlemen, so I will do what I'm very bad at, shut up.
Over to you then, Anders.
No, just very briefly, I do believe that we should be better in partnering on some of these issues, because what we are experiencing now is that every single organization is building up capacity to meet every issues ourselves, and we should be much better in utilizing years and years of experiences in other organizations to actually be better in doing some of the stuff that might not be our core business, but still have to be an integral part in what we're doing. I think we are facing a lot of institutional obstacles for that. We see, as a humanitarian, a lot of development organizations coming into the humanitarian world because that's where the money is now. So we see a lot of proliferation of organizations who have been very good at doing development work, but well, they lack funding. So now the issue is getting into this. We see big donors which are now very, very, very focused on having a few and big partners because it's too difficult actually to handle a lot of different small partners, and we should be better actually in respecting each other's competencies and creating consortia and working closely together. I'm saying that as representative of an organization which by history and by proxy is very, very difficult to work together with because we have a specific mandate and we care very much about that mandate, but even the Red Cross should be much better in working together. And I think there is some synergy in working together, and that we actually could improve, especially our way of working together with organizations like yours. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I can't shut up. So I think I just would like to add on one thing on what Anders just said. You know, we've been talking for decades about the necessity of linking the humanitarian aid to a more long-term development assistance. And in these weeks and months and years, we are talking even more about it, because when the refugee situation is not a temporary situation any longer, but in average, isn't it now 17 years or something like that, that a refugee will stay in a refugee camp, it's obviously we have to link our humanitarian efforts much, much more to our development efforts. And here I think that exactly the subject we have today is a very, very good example and a possibility of saying, if we want to turn some of the refugee camps into a more long-term development assistance effort, linking also to the local authorities and the local and the hosting country and blah, 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 value chains for the enterprises and what do we have, then we could take this as a key priority and saying, if that should succeed, this is, we know that, to get the women with us, the gender, and to avoid, all the violence we have today and the health problems is a key factor in actually doing that. So that could be a bridge we have been longing for and seeking for many, many decades and never really succeeded actually to build.
Thanks. Let's have 2 last questions or comments from anybody. I see a hand down there. A mic is coming.
Thank you very much. My name is Robin May Schott. I'm senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and thank you for a great afternoon. One of the questions I've heard in the background, which I think is so important, is the question, who leaves and who stays? Dr. MOUAKEA mentioned that women may be the last to leave because of the sense of responsibility for care of the family and in the community. And CLAUS H.R.H.CROWN just said, when you get 10 men together, bad things can happen. And we know this, I mean, there's discussions now about hypermasculinity, street violence. We know this from sexual violence in situations of atrocities, that there, develops bonds between men when they don't have structures of family life around them and so forth. So it's quite a serious question whether there's this gender imbalance. It's become a debate in Europe after New Year's Eve in Cologne and the whole discussion about, the young male illegal migrants. So I'm wondering whether one should also ask, how do you address this question of who leaves and who stays in the community and the camps? What does it mean to have a kind of gender balance there?
Thank you. Is there a last question or comment from anybody in the audience? Okay. Then we close here. So I'll give the floor just for 1 or 2 minutes for each of the panelists to comment on the question of gender imbalance and any other final remarks of today's conference. Claus, I'll start with you again.
Well, thank you very much, and that one is really a very hard nut to crack, I admit. I think I would want to make a link to what Martin was just talking about, because if you look at camps, and you don't create real productive behavior, if these people just get charity, then they have no motive. I mean, it's not a place that a young man wants to stay. If also he would prefer to go out to fight or buy a Kalashnikov and invent a different business model, it's very tempting. So you have, in a way, if you have displacement, you have to find a way to integrate these displaced people into some kind of economic activity to create a future. I mean, it's dramatic what you see in Dadaab. It has stayed there. We have never managed to integrate that operation into the Kenyan economy for obvious political reasons. I do understand that it's complicated because you then accept that they have to stay, but there's no way they can go back in the foreseeable future. And this creates a very, very dangerous situations. So again, I think we have to tell our development colleagues, please focus your assistance, your development money on the most fragile and the most volatile and the most risky parts of the country. The humanitarians will then help you, but you have to create some kind of livelihood and stuff that can work. And I'm always saying to those people that prefer to build motorways from the presidential palace to the airport, that's not what creates stability in the country. What creates stability is that you tackle the vulnerability. So move your development money there. That would reduce the risk. Then perhaps as humanitarians we can cope with the residual catastrophes, and then hopefully private investment and big institutional investors will take care of the rest. But it's very complex. I know I digressed far away from what you said, but there are not even 10 men in the room, so we're all safe.
Okay, Martin, your final remarks or comments?
It's a huge question, and I really think Claus has got a point. If you don't create a situation, and that goes basically for any crisis solution in general, where you can offer an alternative to going into fight for the men in these families, then it's very difficult to solve that problem. And that is one of the big dilemmas. I remember when I was a young man, I heard, I just don't remember his name now, you might remember it, CLAUS. It was the responsible in Mozambique, an Italian guy, very controversial, who spent all the money, all the relief money, and all the rebuilding money to buy land to all the young men having guns and machine guns, which was very controversial from a UN point of view, at that time at least. But he succeeded, because he got the guns and he got the men and their families out in a peaceful work or job, growing crops and getting on life. And I'm not saying this kind of programs are not controversial and problematic in itself, but I'm just trying to say that we need to create development and alternative things to do, both for the men and for the women, but especially probably for the men, if we have to address the specific challenge you're mentioning here. If this is my goodbye, then I would just want to thank all of you sitting here for your efforts. And I think that that's what could give a hope in a situation where you sometimes get rather frustrated on a daily basis of how the world is developing these days, that we are, and you are, so many very professional people dealing with this. I think that leaves hope. And also when you are visiting refugee camps and you're meeting the people living there, that you have so many strong souls and persons to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. And Anders?
I would say the easy solution to your question is that you should reunify the families as fast as possible, but that might be an improper way of dealing with that issue in Denmark. No, but I mean it's really a very, very tough call, and Klaus, making refugees and displaced productive is the key to the solution of many of the issues. The problem is that it has been really tested for many years, and it's really difficult because primarily the host communities and the host countries are not too happy to see people actually be productive in their own country. Just see how we're fighting with I mean, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Turkey, refugees are not allowed to work, and they are even being expelled if they are actually getting a work where they can supply themselves. So I think the key is not only to make the refugees productive, but the key is also to give host communities as well as host countries a carrot for being host to a lot of refugees, and what we really miss out of is rewarding Jordan, rewarding Turkey, rewarding Lebanon for housing millions and millions of refugees and making it a development opportunity for them as well. And this will cost a lot more than the 9 billion that is on the table in London today. I know that, but in the long run, that might be cheaper for us to do actually than what we are doing. I think it's been extremely encouraging to participate in this debate. I think we have a long way to go, but the way should be together. And I think the idea of being better to partner, being better to learn from each other's experiences, and also knowing that the development nexus is coming closer to the relief one, because most protective crises are 70 years and more, so we have to bring development experience into the relief work as well, and there I see an opportunity actually for us to convert our methods and ways of working. So thank you for initiating this debate, and it's hopefully only the start.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I really want to thank all of you for contributing, not just with analysis, but also with some very concrete situations, both in the very sort of immediate emergency situation, but also certainly trying to look at a more holistic, all-encompassing solution to this very complicated area. So I really want to thank you for all your suggestions and the concrete recommendations, both going from a very specific suggestion on shelter shelter and certain protection areas for girls, to the idea of subcluster picked up from UGOCHI earlier today, to the partnership, the coordination, the advocacy from within the community, attracting the relief cowboys and other ideas. So thanks a lot to all three of you for that. Let's give them a big applause. So now we are really entering our last minute of the conference, and I don't have a lot more to say. I just have the pleasure now of introducing our last speaker, who is our Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sexual and Reproductive Health. It's Michael Aastrup Jensen, and he's also representing the government party, Venstre, or the Liberal Party, and I want to give you the floor, Michael, but just before I do that, let me please invite all of you to have a glass of wine or some little snacks with us after the conference. Don't forget the most important at a conference, what's that? The networking and the corridor talks. So please join us for the last half hour, and please do that. And with Ugochi's words, just do it. And Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, now it's a tough spot. I know I'm keeping you from the wine, I'm keeping you from the networking, I'm keeping you from the food. But I'll try anyway. You know, when I'm, heard all the speeches, and first of all, thank you so much for all the very, very fine points all the speakers made, especially our Royal Highness, the Crown Princess Mary, who I really, really adore as a Dane, that we have such a fine Crown Princess who actually gets so much involved in a very, very fine job. But when I hear all the speakers, and when I hear about, how much work that has been done, but how enormous amount of work we still have to be doing to get, more perspective on this, to get the media more involved, to get the citizens more involved, to get someone like me more involved, and also to get government more involved. We have like a path in front of us, which is so enormous long, perhaps a bit, narrow somewhere, and so on and so on. And we're talking very much about, we have the 17 social development goals, and they're very fine, all of them. I think perhaps one of the key aspects about, trying to get some kind of solution about fulfilling the 17 social development goals is perhaps, be quite frank, saying all countries cannot be 100% active on all the 17 goals. But perhaps some countries should focus on some of the goals that they are perhaps more knowledge about, or they have, more interest in, and so on and so on. And we in Denmark, being as liberal as we are, I'm not talking party politics now, don't worry, but being as liberal as we are, we should be active on the field about sexual and, health and all the reasons why, women should be more equal, and all these, very liberal policies that all the other countries do not even want to touch, just 1%. So what we are thinking about doing in the all-parliamentary group is, how can we as Denmark be as active on that? And we need your input. Both this conference has, of course, generated a lot of input to us, but also, starting from May this year, just in a couple of months' time, our ambassador to India is going to finish his job with recommendations to, government, but also to Parliament about in which direction are we going to keep focusing our development focus on. And I think, if I have to be personal now, I think we should try to focus on areas that we touch upon in this conference, our main focus regarding development aid. But we're going to have a discussion about that, don't worry. So I think I'll end on that note and saying thank you so much for to see a full house, and thank you so much for all the speakers, especially you who have traveled from far away places, also dangerous places. I really have been inspired, and on that note, I say thank you so much, and let's network, and let's keep going in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you.